So this morning we are talking about the spiritual gift of leadership. And so given who we are and the people that we are, and the person that we, at least come here to talk about and to follow in the way of, that person of Jesus, then he seems like a pretty logical place to start when it comes to the idea of leadership and what leaders look like. Because if we can't look at Jesus as the probably best example we have of leadership, then quite frankly, I'm not sure what we're doing here. But we are here, so we might as well talk about Jesus. All right? So this is a story from John's Gospel, and it's, I think, for many of us, one that we know well, or at least somewhat familiar with, some kind of passing understanding that we know that this thing happened. Right? That somewhere along the way, when Jesus was eating with his disciples, he chose to do something rather out of the ordinary. It would definitely be out of the ordinary today, but was still out of the ordinary even for the time, which was to wash everybody's feet. Now, if you're not quite sure where we are, I'll remind you, we are right about at we're right about at the Last Supper, right? Even though we're kind of in the middle of John's Gospel, the last half is all basically, Good Friday and Easter and all those sorts of things. So John gets to this place rather early in his telling of the story. So Jesus is actually engaged in one of the last times he's going to be around his disciples. It's a very special time. It's the Passover season. It's a time of reflection. It's a time of celebration. It is a very loaded time emotionally, just normally, and the disciples at this point have some hints that something more profound is going to happen, and of course Jesus knows something really important is about to happen, and it's amongst all of that that Jesus chooses to do something rather out of the ordinary. Now, it's not out of the ordinary that somebody would wash somebody's feet. That actually happened a lot in this time and place, especially if you were having guests into your home. So, imagine when you're having guests into your house, right? And especially if you're having them over for a meal, as the disciples are a guest in somebody's home this evening, at that evening, you want them to have a good time, right? You want to treat them well. You want to treat them with honor and respect. If you're going to have guests over, you try to do your best to make them feel comfortable, make them feel welcome. Well, one of the ways that you would make your guests at this time feel comfortable and welcome and also feel honored is when they came in or while they were there would be to wash their feet. So it may sound rather weird to us, but it would actually be fairly common at this time and place to go to your friend's house and they would have, especially if they were more well off, but you go to your friend's house and they either have one of their servants or one of their children literally scrub your tootsies. I don't want that. If I'm ever in your home, we can skip it. As I'm sure a lot of us would, but at this time and place, it was different. First off, people wore sandals most of the time. A lot of people didn't wear any shoes. It was dirty. It was dusty. Part of what that homeowner is doing is making sure that you're not tracking dirt and grime into their house. There was a practical element to it. So it was an understood practice. So the washing of the feet in general, as a guest in somebody's home, that wasn't necessarily weird. That is something that did happen. They did have a bowl and a basin of water and towels and all that laying around just for that purpose. What was interesting and what made this one different is that before it would always be the responsibility, the foot washing responsibility basically went to whoever was the lowest on the totem pole. Right? So if you were the youngest child in a house, you were probably washing a lot of feet. Vivian, I don't know where she's back there. Okay, she doesn't even, all right, well, we'll talk about her again, I guess. She wasn't here last week when I was talking about her, and that was no fun. All right, but that would be your job, and then you would hope someday your mom and dad would have a younger brother or sister so that they could wash the feet. If you were a house that had servants, it would be your servant's job. Right? It was considered the job of the lowliest person in the house to do this. So the fact that in this case, it is Jesus doing it, Jesus who in this house and in this place probably actually has the highest status and highest stature of anybody else there, the fact that it's him choosing to do it is rather and actually completely profound. And he's doing it for a reason, not just because Peter's feet smelled bad, maybe they did, and they wanted to have a more comfortable dinner, but he's doing it to show them something important about who he is and who he wants them to be. He basically, even though he is the leader, he is the one in charge, he adopts the role of a servant. And he goes and finds the most menial, the lowest, the most honestly probably rather gross job he could find, and chooses to do it as an act of service to his disciples. So we know, a lot of us know that story. What I find is interesting is when he starts talking about it, and when he starts talking to his people about it and explaining what just happened, how he chooses to explain it. And I think this is where we get the most important lessons about leadership, at least as far as Jesus was talking about, was here. First and foremost, what I like is after he's done it and completed and washed everybody's feet, he goes and he says, "Do you know what I've done?" He basically says, "You have called me teacher and Lord," which is correct, you should. And of course they should, because he is. He is their teacher. He is their Lord. They've been with him for 3 years. He's important. Everybody knows it. They certainly have known it. They've watched him do miracles. They've watched him shut down the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They've watched him take on people. They've literally watched him raise somebody from the dead, right? They know he's important and he has authority. He has authority in a way that nobody else they've ever seen does. And he says, "You call me this because it is what I am." Jesus doesn't actually mind, and Jesus doesn't stop from claiming his authority. He says, "Yes, I am a teacher. Yes, I am your Lord. This is right that you do these things to me because that is my role and that is my place and this is who I am." So first and foremost, what he does as a leader is he claims the influence and the authority that he has. And then he says, if this is me, if I am the teacher, if I am the Lord, and yet I choose to be a servant in this way, how much more are you all called to do the same? And while John likes to, sometimes the way John phrases things is a little weird, but that bit at the end when he's talking about servants are not above the masters and that sort of things, what Jesus is basically saying there is, if I'm the one at the top of the totem pole, and we all agree that I am, and I'm willing to do this, then you have to be willing to do this too. Because if you are saying you are not willing to do it, then you are pushing yourself above the top. And that's not how this works. So Jesus is reminding them that if I, in my position of authority and influence, am willing to do this, then obviously you and everyone who comes after you can do no less but to serve in the same way that I have served. Now, this idea of Jesus and service and what it is to serve as a leader has been part and parcel. It has been part of the Christian experience, basically, literally from the beginning, because it's right here as this really important part of John's gospel. So this idea that we are to be leaders who serve is right here. Now, later, much, much later, there was another guy named Robert Greenleaf, who in the 1970s would coin a phrase, servant leadership. And in fact, servant leadership is something that's talked about a lot today. It's something we talk about, it's something I've talked about in our school board work and around the school district. It talks about in the church a lot. And Greenleaf has this great quote. He says, in other words, we are servants who lead, not leaders that serve. And his thought is that we are first and foremost servants. We are here to serve one another. That is our primary job. And when we do that job well, when we do the job of serving each other well, then we will do the job of leading even that much better. And one of the criticisms that there is of Greenleaf and his things is, you didn't invent this. Can I introduce you to Jesus, who said something about this a long time ago? But I always love it, and you guys know this, I always love it when other parts of the world and other parts of society rediscover or discover things about things that most of us, as people of faith, have known for centuries. And as people of faith, we know we are called to serve one another, and Jesus gives us the most dramatic version of it possible. We are called to claim our authority when we have it. We are called to claim our influence when we have it. And then we are called to use that authority and influence we have, not for ourselves, but to serve others. and we must do both. Sometimes the failure of leadership that we have, or the failure of leaderships that we practice or that I see often, is leaders who don't actually recognize that they are, in fact, leaders. People who have authority or have influence who don't actually recognize the fact that they have authority and influence. Sometimes I think we actually stay willfully ignorant of it. We don't want to know that we actually do have authority and influence on others because we don't want the responsibility of having to use it well. But if we are blessed to be in a position where we do have authority or influence over others, that comes in all sorts of forms, informal and formal, then we have no choice, if we are people of faith and followers of Christ, but figure out a way to use that influence and authority to serve others. That's what Jesus wanted from us. That's who he told us we are supposed to be. Now, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about two examples about it, both of people who have what I would call kind of like formal authority, and those who have what I would call kind of informal authority or influence. When I was in seminary, after a couple of years, I got to know people. You might have figured this out. Like, I like to meet people, right? I'm a networker, right? So you put me in an environment with other people, then I'm going to meet people. I'm going to figure out who they are, and I'm going to honestly figure out who has, the influence and who's the important people and who's got the authority in the situation. And as Jim knows, I'm going to figure out who has the money, because you need to know who has the money, because that's how you get things done. And so as part of this, I got to meet some people. I got to actually be friends with the president of our seminary, met some people through some family that lived there, and ended up in the orbit of several, and including one of the people I was in the orbit of was another guy named John. I don't know why everybody in this sermon series is named John, but he is. And that's my friend John Edgar, who was the founder and pastor of Church for All People. And we went down there actually to visit his church as part of a class. And Church for All People, which I think I've talked about before, but the brief history is Church for All People was a center for Methodist ministry in downtown Columbus, which is very like Rust Belt, hard time part of Columbus. It's a very economically depressed area, but it was a center of mission and ministry for United Methodist churches in the area. They had a free store ministry. They eventually had a free clinic. They did all kinds of stuff down there. And he was the pastor when he was a district superintendent who set all this up, and then later went to basically go be the chaplain of that place. And out of that place, they eventually gave birth to a congregation. And it is the most eclectic, interesting congregation you will ever be in. Dana and I visited there several times. Literally, on one time, I'm sitting there, and we were doing worship, and there's like a homeless guy sitting next to me on this side, and the guy next to me was a lawyer, right? Like, that's who hangs out in this place. It's really kind of crazy. And John is John is the pastor of this band of misfit toys, as he would say. And because we were down there visiting for a class, I introduced myself to him. Mentioned do the thing you do where you mention the people you have in common. Right? You got to do that. Like, oh, I hear you know so and so. I know so and so. Oh yeah, you got to do the little bonding thing. It's networking. You got to do it. Anyway. And so we're chatting and talking, and we leave, and then about a couple days later, my phone rings, and it's John. And what I know of John is that John is a known person, very well-respected person. I actually was originally introduced to him through of his ministries, actually from an executive from Limited Brands, which is a big part of Columbus, because they had dumped a dump truck full of money on his new housing initiative that he was a part of. And I know he hung out in those circles. I know he hung out with the big and the important of the foundations and all those folks. And he called me up. And he's like, hey, there's these two little churches in my community. They're not doing very well. We want to try to help them. We're looking for a couple of people to come down and be pastors of these churches. The cheapest way to do that is to get students. Seminarians work for cheap. Would you be interested in maybe being one of those people? And I'm like, well, what would that look like? We talked about it for a while, and he's like, well, you'll meet weekly with me. And I'm like, really? You have time to meet weekly with me? He's like, oh, yes, this is important. You'll meet weekly with me. I will mentor you guys through this process. The goal will be here for a couple of years, and we'll see what we can do. And so I went down there and met with him. And while I was in the process of talking with him, literally in his waiting room, waiting to come after me, was somebody else that I knew from the Columbus Foundation, which is a giant community foundation, an executive there who was waiting to talk to her about a grant program that he wanted to start, and a homeless guy who was looking for some help and resources for a reference to get a job. And John was going to meet with me, and then meet with him, and then meet with her. And when I realized who this guy was, and how he lived his life, and what he was willing to do, and how he was willing to serve, and how he was willing to live, and how he led, I thought, finally I found somebody who leads in the way that I would hope to lead. Because previous to that time, I actually took a church leadership class while I was there, and it was we took it over, it was a whole class in 1 month. It was during our intensive months. It was every day for a week, and it was Church Leadership 101, and I got to be there with other students. And if you do a class like that, y'all get really comfortable with each other really fast. And what I learned in that class was, not to throw any of my colleagues under the bus, but what I learned in that class is that almost everybody else in that class had a very different understanding of what it was to be a pastor, and a very different desires for being a pastor, and what it is that they wanted to do, and what it is that they were looking forward to. And what was clear to me in that meeting was a lot of them were really looking forward to being in charge, right? Really looking forward to getting to make decisions and tell people what to do. And I looked at it and said, that's not really my desire in this. Yes, sure, sometimes you do have to do that. You've got to lead, somebody's got to make decisions, and sometimes that person is me. But that's not why I want to do it. And so when I met John, and here was this leader who was both successful in ministry like I wanted to be, but also was doing it from this true place of leadership and desire to see everybody win and succeed, I was like, oh, finally, here's somebody I want to work with. John had a lot of formal authority. He was the appointed pastor. He'd been a district superintendent, which is a big deal in our conference, was a big deal in our church. He had resources. He had connections to people. He had connections to money. He was well respected. He had a lot of formal authority and influence. And every time I met with him, and every time I talked to him, what he talked about was, how do you use that, and how did he use it? Not for his own gain, but for all those people around him, all those people that God had put into his life that he needed to love and serve. And I watched him literally move between meetings about $1 million grants and making sure that this one guy got the outfit that he needed for the job interview he had next week at McDonald's. And in his mind, they were both that important. And I still remember John. He's still around. He's not actually the pastor of that church anymore. He is passed on to somebody else at this point. But I still remember the lessons he learned, and I learned more in those 2 years with him in my on-the-job training than I spent many, many thousands of dollars on in the 4 years I was in seminary, to be honest. But you had to do one to get to the other, so there you go. John was a person of formal authority and formal influence, and he used it to serve others. The other person that quickly came to mind when I was thinking about this was somebody I actually met years before, and her name was Susan. So in about 2004, which is, God, somehow almost 20 years ago, no idea how that's true, but somehow about 2004, I was working for a software company. We did public health software. We did disease surveillance and vaccine tracking and all that sort of stuff. And we had just got a contract with Washington State, and I was given care of this contract. And our goal was to take their little homegrown system that they had built over time and replace it with our online software package that we had and move everything around. And so in order to do that, you have to first understand what it is that they do, right? How it is that they work now, and how we're going to translate that into our system. So those are usually the first meetings you have over and over and over again, is you have to first learn about where they are and then figure out how to bridge them where it is they're going to go. And so I remember my first meeting with all of these folks. So I'm there with all of the people from the Washington State Department of Health, from basically the guy who reports to the number one guy, executives, all these important people, the people who run the vaccination department, all that stuff. I'm meeting with all of these important folks, and we're like, okay, we have some questions. We need to know where to find out about these things. And almost to every question we would ask, like, okay, how does this work, or how do you do this, or what's important here, all that, everyone would say, talk to Susan. We're like, okay. And Susan's not at this meeting? You're like, no, Susan's way too busy to be at this meeting. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, her time is precious, so you're going to have to, but you can probably find some time to meet with her. We'll carve out some time. And we'd ask another question. He's like, yeah, you got to talk to Susan. It kind of became a joke at the end, right? It was like one of those things like, well, what about this? Like, let me guess, Susan. Like, yep. So we go down the list. We have this meeting. We go to lunch and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just trying to imagine, which corner office is Susan in, right? Does she work directly with the governor? Like, what's going on? Because she's the one who has all the answers. And they're finally like, oh, okay, I think if we go right now, you could have time and you could meet Susan. I'm like, okay. So we go down, and they take me down the hallway, past all the big offices, and they take me down a little hallway to where the cubicles are. And they go to one that's kind of off to the side, and they say, Jeremy, I want you to meet Susan. And Susan was there, and Susan's job was the one who basically answered the phones for everyone who used the system they had currently. She was the one that everybody talked to. She was the one when people had complaints or concerns. When something broke, you talked to Susan. When you wanted something fixed, you talked to Susan. If you wanted something changed, you talked to Susan. If something didn't work the way that it should work or wasn't work the way that it was supposed to work, she was that person. She had all of the connections with all of the clients, all of the end users, because when you're working in this way, our client might be the Department of Health, but they're not the ones actually using the system on a daily basis. They're not the ones putting the data in. It's all the doctors and nurses in all the various places that are doing that. And all of those people didn't talk to anybody at Department of Health other than Susan. Susan, though I'm sure made far less than anybody else in the room that I was in, was the one with all the influence and the authority. She was the one telling the designers what to design, what the people to fix, what to fix. She was the one telling the people in charge, this is how it needs to be better, this is how it needs to be different. Susan was the one that had all the influence. And she used it to make sure that her fellow nurses and everyone else that was downstream of her was taken care of. And if they had a concern, it became her concern. And if they had thought something could be better, she would champion that thing that could be better until it was made better. And Susan was hands down the most important and most troublesome person to work with. Because when you're working with a group of engineers who themselves think they know better, Susan would quickly correct us that we did not indeed know better, and that she did. And she wasn't doing it to be mean, and she wasn't doing it for herself, and never once did I ever think she was ever doing it because she wanted herself to be important. But she recognized that in that space, when those decisions was made, she was there, not just with her voice, but the voice of all those other people who would be using this thing that we did. She needed to advocate for them. She wanted their lives to be as easy as possible, and she wanted to serve them as best she could. And she would do that by standing up to those of us who think sometimes we know better. And I loved Susan for it, and I hope that she's still there. And she made that project one of the best projects I ever worked on, one of the most successful projects I ever worked on. We were on time and on budget because Susan wanted us to be. And when we rolled out the product, and we started to go around and do trainings with our end users, every one of us, the one thing everybody else wanted to talk about or ask about is, how is Susan? She's the best. And not more than a couple times did somebody not tell us, you better take care of her. Susan did not have formal authority. She was not the person in charge. She was not high up the organizational chart. She wasn't making the big bucks like everyone else was making in the rooms I was usually talking and speaking in. But Susan did have the influence, and she was a leader of her people. She knew who her people was. She was their voice. She served them, and she advocated for them. Susan is a leader in every bit the way that God, and through Jesus, calls us to be leader. She cared about the needs of others more than she cared about herself, because oftentimes the requests she would make life easier for them and sometimes harder for her. We need Johns and we need Susans. We need leaders who will understand and recognize the influence and the authority that they have, and then ask themselves the important and profound question, how do I best use this, not for myself, but to serve others? That's what Jesus demonstrates when he washes the feet. Because let us remember another important fact. Jesus did not limit who he was serving in that moment. Jesus washed 12 people's feet that day, including the one who would betray him. Judas had his feet washed by Jesus. Judas was at the table to receive the bread and the cup as well. God never limited the grace that he was offering to anybody, including the one who he knew was going to conspire against him. That is the kind of leadership and servanthood that God calls us to and asks us to be a part of. Now, we may not be people of great authority. We may not have a lot of people reporting to us. We may not have a bunch of people we feel we have influence over. But my guess is there is some group of people, big, small, maybe family and friends, who look to each and every one of you from time to time for guidance, for a good ear to listen, for some help during hard times. That is our chance to be the leader and servant that God calls us to be as well. We may have hundreds, we may have thousands, we may have dozens, we may only have a handful. But each of us is connected to somebody else. Each of us has the opportunity to be an influence on somebody else. And how are we going to use that? If we are to take Jesus serious, we are to do it with the heart of servants, with our primary care and concern being for our neighbors. As we remember, to love God because God loved us first, to love our neighbor, whoever they are, because that's who God gave us to care about, and of course to love ourselves, because God demonstrated that we are worthy of love. Amen.